The wind howled through the trees, a relentless force that swept across the snow-covered landscape, howling like a lost soul. Jared stood at the edge of the forest, his breath visible in the freezing air, and for a moment it felt as though the mountain itself was alive, breathing with him. The peaks loomed above, their jagged edges a constant reminder of the world he had left behind. For years now he had been here, alone, without a single soul to break the silence. It was the kind of place where time slowed to a crawl, and nature ruled with an unforgiving hand. Jared had come to this isolated mountain cabin years ago, drawn here by a pain that was too deep to face. His family, his life, had been taken from him in a single, shattering moment, a catastrophic avalanche that had claimed his wife, his daughter, and the future he had dreamed of. Since that day, he hadn't been able to look anyone in the eye. He hadn't been able to speak the words that would bring the kind of healing he so desperately needed. Instead, he had chosen the wilderness, the woods, the snow, the biting cold. These were his companions now, the only ones he could trust to never leave him, to never demand more than he could give. Jared's cabin, a simple structure built with his own hands, stood as a monument to his isolation. The cold air found its way inside, no matter how tightly the walls were sealed. But Jared didn't mind. He didn't need comfort, not anymore. He had the forest, and in its silence, he found a kind of peace. The mountains didn't ask questions. They didn't care about the scars on his heart or the guilt that gnawed at him every night when he closed his eyes. They simply existed. And for Jared, that was enough. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the routine of hunting, chopping wood and making fire. He had honed his skills as a hunter and woodsman over the years, blending with the wilderness as though it had always been a part of him. But deep down, Jared was a man running from something, fleeing from the weight of memories that clung to him like shadows. He was a man who had buried everything, including the very essence of who he had once been. Then one day, as he trekked through the forest, rifle slung over his shoulder, something caught his eye, the faintest rustling, a shadow against the snow. And there, barely visible among the trees, he saw it. A dog, shivering in the cold, its ribs clearly showing through the thin fur. Chained to a tree, left behind like an abandoned toy, the animal whimpered in desperation, its eyes filled with fear and hunger. Jared's heart clenched. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pulling him back to a reality he had long buried. He wasn't a man who looked after others. He had nothing to give. But something in him snapped. The sight of the dog, left to suffer in the frigid cold, broke through the walls he had built around himself. He had survived the avalanche, but he couldn't turn his back on this helpless creature that needed him. And as he stepped closer, rifle forgotten in his hand, Jared knew that, for the first time in years, he was about to make a choice that would change everything. The wind bit at Jared's face as he trudged through the snow, the weight of his rifle pulling him forward, each step a familiar rhythm. He had grown accustomed to the stillness of the mountains, but today the silence felt heavier, as though the world was holding its breath. As he moved deeper into the trees, something caught his eye. A flash of movement, a faint whimper, a sound so fragile, so out of place, it pierced through the calm. His heart skipped. There, barely visible through the snow-covered branches, was a dog. Its fur was matted, streaked with snow, its body thin and trembling. The animal's eyes were wide with fear, its small frame chained to a tree like a forgotten thing, left to die alone in the freezing cold. Jared's breath caught in his throat. He was a man who lived by the harsh rules of the wilderness, but this was something different. The dog's suffering was raw, its vulnerability a stark contrast to the unforgiving world Jared had come to know. He crouched down, his heart racing. It looked like it was barely holding on to life. Before he could approach, A harsh voice broke the silence. "Leave it alone," the man shouted from behind a cluster of trees, his voice rough and cracked like someone who had spent too many years battling the elements. Jared turned quickly, his instincts kicking in. The man stood there, in his 60s, weather-worn and unshaven, glaring at Jared with the kind of fury that only comes from years of bitterness. "Doesn't need anyone meddling in his business," the man spat, his eyes hard and cold. Jared's chest tightened. The dog's suffering had already told him everything he needed to know. The chain, the way it clinked against the tree with each weak movement the dog made. It wasn't a leash. It was a symbol of abandonment. Jared's mind raced. The man wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to care. He had left the dog in the woods to freeze, to starve, to die alone. The realization hit Jared like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an unfortunate situation. This was cruelty. The man hadn't just forgotten the dog. He had chosen to leave it behind, to let nature take its course. And Jared, despite his isolation, despite the walls he had built around his heart, knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. But before Jared could say a word, the man turned and disappeared into the forest, his footsteps muffled by the snow. No apology, no explanation, just the sound of a man retreating back into his own darkness. Jared stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. He looked back at the dog, its eyes pleading, its body shaking with cold. In that moment, Jared realized that his life, his isolation, had been nothing more than running away from pain. But now, there was something, someone, who needed him. The mountain had brought him to this moment, this one small creature who needed help. And for the first time in years, Jared knew he had to step out of the shadows. He couldn't turn his back on the dog. He wouldn't. Jared stood frozen in the snow, the dog's trembling body barely 10 feet away, chained to the tree like an afterthought in the wilderness. His breath hung in the air like a cloud of regret as he studied the small animal. Its eyes, wide, hopeless, and lost, stared up at him, and for a split second, Jared felt something stir inside him. He hadn't felt anything for a long time. It was as if the dog was staring straight into the emptiness he'd been living in for years, echoing the same quiet despair that had taken over his soul since the avalanche. A part of him wanted to turn away. He had spent years in the mountains for a reason. He didn't owe anything to anyone, least of all a dog. His heart pounded in his chest, and his feet felt rooted to the ground. "It's not my problem," he muttered to himself, his hands tightening around the rifle slung over his shoulder. "I didn't ask for this." But the words felt hollow in the cold air. The dog was barely clinging to life, its fur matted, its body frail and covered in snow. It wasn't asking for pity, but for help. And Jared knew it. He turned his back, fighting the impulse to walk away. "Just leave it, Jared," he told himself. "It's not your fight." His mind screamed at him to keep moving, to bury the urge to intervene. He'd lost too much already. The thought of letting another living thing into his life, of letting himself care again, was too much to bear. The mountains had been his refuge, his escape from the world's pain and the memories that still haunted him. But then, the dog whined. A soft, pitiful sound that seemed to rip right through him, reaching deep into his chest. His steps faltered, and his resolve cracked. "Damn it," Jared whispered under his breath. He looked back over his shoulder, catching the dog's gaze again. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror every day. The look of someone who had been left behind, who had nothing left to lose. "You're not alone," he whispered to the dog, even though he barely believed it himself. His decision was made. It was as if the mountain had whispered its answer to him. With one sharp motion, he pulled out his knife and knelt in the snow, the cold biting into his knees. He sliced through the chain, the metal clinking as it fell away from the tree. The dog didn't move at first. It just stared at him, as if unsure of what had just happened. Slowly, Jared reached down, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the dog's cold fur. It didn't resist as he carefully lifted it into his arms, carrying the fragile creature back through the snow, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. Each step felt like a small victory. The cabin seemed further away than usual, as though the world itself was testing his resolve. When they finally reached the warmth of the cabin, Jared laid the dog down on a blanket, starting a fire and gathering what little supplies he had. He didn't know how to heal a broken spirit or a broken body, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. He was staying. And somehow, that was enough. Blaze's first step into the warmth of the cabin marked the beginning of Jared's transformation. The dog's fur was matted with snow, its body trembling in the cold, but the light in its eyes, faint yet undeniable, stirred something deep inside Jared. He didn't know it yet, but that spark, that flicker of life, would slowly ignite a change within him. He had lived so long in the shadows of his own mind, burying every trace of emotion under layers of grief and isolation. But Blaze, a creature so full of life despite the suffering it had endured, had found a way to break through. Jared didn't name it immediately, but after a week of seeing the dog's first signs of recovery, he muttered the name. Blaze, to himself one quiet evening, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. It seemed right. A blaze, a spark of life, a fire in the heart where there had been only ice for so long. The name carried more than just a sound. It symbolized a new beginning, both for Blaze and for Jared. With each day that passed, as Blaze grew stronger, Jared's emotional barriers began to weaken. For the first time in years, Jared found himself talking, not just to the dog, but aloud. "Good boy, Blaze," he would say, running his hand through the dog's fur. He laughed once, a rare sound, as Blaze tried to chase his own tail in a circle. He hadn't realized it at first, but with each word he spoke to Blaze, he was letting go of the ghosts that had haunted him. The memory of his wife's laughter, the vision of his daughter's smile, the heart-wrenching image of them caught in the avalanche. Those memories had been buried deep, festering in the dark corners of his mind. Now, with the dog at his side, Jared found himself slowly letting them out, one word at a time, one conversation at a time. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb of isolation. It had become a home, even if it was only for him and Blaze. For the first time in ages, Jared felt a sense of connection, a bond that he hadn't even realized he was craving. And then, one day, that connection was tested. It started with Elsa. She had been a friend once, long before Jared's grief had driven him into the wilderness. A kind-hearted woman in her 50s, Elsa ran a small inn in the nearby town. She had always respected Jared's need for solitude, but she worried for him. It was Elsa who had once left him supplies, food, blankets, firewood, without demanding anything in return. Jared knew she cared, but he hadn't let her into his world since the accident. When Elsa came by that day, though, she didn't ask how he was doing. She simply placed a basket of supplies on the porch and looked at him with a long, knowing stare. "You're not fooling anyone, Jared," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I can see it in your eyes. You're healing." Jared didn't know how to respond. He had spent years pushing people like Elsa away, too afraid to face his own pain. But in that moment, he realized she was right. Blaze had given him a reason to open up again, to feel something other than the heavy weight of loss. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, but the words felt empty. Elsa just nodded and walked away, leaving him to his thoughts. But then, the past came crashing back into the present. Tom, the man who had abandoned Blaze, returned. Jared had no warning, no inkling that the man who had once treated Blaze like a piece of property would show up again. Tom appeared one afternoon, angry and wild-eyed, standing on the edge of Jared's property with a bitter sneer on his face. "That dog's mine," he growled, the venom in his voice unmistakable. Jared stood still, watching Tom approach, the weight of Blaze in his arms. "You abandoned him," Jared said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "You left him to die in the snow." Tom's face twisted in anger. "That dog's just an animal. I don't need any damn meddling from you." His fists clenched, and his voice cracked with rage. "You don't know anything about me or what I've been through." Jared, who had once known the weight of loss all too well, felt the anger rising in his chest. This man had no right to demand anything from him, especially not Blaze. But Tom was bitter, manipulative, and for a moment, Jared felt a flash of old resentment. He had tried to bury his emotions for so long, but now they threatened to spill over. "You don't get to decide what happens to Blaze anymore," Jared said, his voice rising. He looked down at the dog, whose once frightened eyes were now filled with trust. "I'm keeping him. He's mine now." Tom's eyes blazed with fury, but he knew the battle was over. With a final curse, he turned and stalked off into the woods, leaving Jared and Blaze alone. Jared stood there watching Tom disappear, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Blaze, the dog he had saved, had given him a chance to start over. And, with that, Jared realized that the spark of life he had once lost, like the fire that crackled in the hearth, was slowly coming back to life. Blaze had transformed Jared in ways he never thought possible. The once solitary man, whose heart had been frozen in grief, was now waking up to the warmth of a life he had long since abandoned. With each passing day, Blaze grew stronger, his coat glossy and full again, and his playful nature returned. The dog, once a fragile creature on the brink of death, was now Jared's companion, a living, breathing symbol of second chances. In those quiet, serene moments when they shared the fire, Jared found himself talking to Blaze, telling him stories of his past, of the family he had lost, and of the emptiness that had defined his life for so long. He could see it in Blaze's eyes, the same hopelessness Jared had once felt, but it was slowly giving way to hope, to connection. And for the first time in years, Jared dared to dream again. But even as Blaze grew healthier, the shadow of Tom, the dog's original owner, loomed over them. Jared's attachment to Blaze had grown stronger, and with it came a fear of losing the one thing that had pulled him back from the edge. Jared had begun to dream of reconnecting with the world, of rebuilding the relationships he had shut away for so long. But Tom wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. One cold morning, Jared's worst fears were confirmed. Elsa, who had been checking in on him and Blaze, brought troubling news. Tom had been spotted in town, and there were whispers about his involvement in something darker than just abandoning his dog. Jared's heart sank as Elsa explained that Tom was part of a group known for poaching the wildlife in the area. It wasn't just cruelty. It was dangerous, illegal hunting that threatened the fragile balance of the mountain ecosystem. The area was home to endangered species, and Tom's poaching had already decimated much of the local wildlife. What broke Jared even more was the realization that Tom hadn't just abandoned Blaze because he was weak. Blaze had been discarded because he was no longer a useful hunting dog. The bond between Blaze and Jared had made him more than just a tool for Tom. It had made him a companion, someone Jared had come to care for deeply. The betrayal stung deeper now, knowing Blaze had been thrown aside for being useless. As the days passed, Jared couldn't shake the anger that simmered inside him. The ghost of the hunter he had once been reawakened, and he found himself slipping into old habits. The familiar weight of his rifle felt natural in his hands, the cold steel comforting as he set out to track Tom down. He had spent years running from the pain, avoiding the bloodshed of his past, but now the blood ran hot in his veins, and he couldn't ignore it. The poaching needed to stop, and Tom needed to pay for what he had done. When Jared finally came face to face with Tom, the tension was palpable. Tom's cold, calculating eyes met Jared's, and for a moment, everything went still. "You think you can keep him?" Tom sneered, his voice filled with venom. "That dog's mine. You have no idea what he's capable of." But Jared wasn't fooled. He wasn't the same man he had been years ago, the one who had blindly followed orders and hunted for sport. He had seen the damage Tom's actions had caused, and this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. The confrontation escalated quickly. Tom's anger flared, and Jared could feel the old instincts creeping back in, urging him to do what he had been trained to do: hunt, track, and destroy. But as Blaze stood by his side, his head held high, Jared's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting what he had fought to rebuild: his connection to the world, to life, and to Blaze. Tom lunged at him, but Jared was faster, sidestepping the attack and using his strength to knock Tom to the ground. In the struggle, Jared's hand found the rifle, just for a moment. But the memory of his past flashed before his eyes, and he knew that this wasn't the way forward. The old hunter's instincts fought against the man he had become. But as he looked at Blaze, standing firm beside him, Jared knew what he had to do. He needed to stop Tom, not with violence, but with justice. Jared's final choice wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking the cycle of violence that had defined his life. He stood tall, pulling the rifle away and calling for help. The local authorities had been tracking Tom's poaching activities for years, and with the evidence Jared had gathered, they were able to arrest him. Tom was taken away, but Jared's battle wasn't over. He had to rebuild what had been broken, not just in the mountains, but in his own heart. And with Blaze by his side, he knew that redemption was possible. The bond they shared had been forged in the fire of struggle, but it would last because, in the end, love and connection were the most powerful forces of all. Jared stood at the edge of the mountain, looking down at the valley below, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest like the very snow that blanketed the land. He had spent years running from the world, from the people who once knew him, from the man he had been before the avalanche took his family. But standing here now, with Blaze by his side, a dog who had helped him reclaim something he thought was lost forever, Jared knew he couldn't hide anymore. The time had come to make a choice: continue to live in the shadows, clinging to the pain that had defined him, or step out and face the world again, with all the risks and rewards that came with it. Elsa's visit the night before echoed in his mind. She had found him in the cabin, sitting in the dim light of the fire, and without saying much, she had simply reminded him that there were people who cared. Elsa, who had seen him when he was still the friendly young woodsman before life had hardened him. Elsa, who had patiently given him space, but never left him entirely alone. She had encouraged him to report Tom to the authorities, to stop the poaching that threatened the delicate balance of the mountain ecosystem. Jared had hesitated. His old, vengeful instincts told him to handle things on his own, but something had shifted in him after everything with Blaze. It was time to stop the cycle of violence and secrecy. The morning after his conversation with Elsa, Jared made the decision. With Blaze beside him, he walked to the town, where he found the authorities and gave them the information they needed to bring Tom's poaching operation to an end. It wasn't just about Blaze anymore. It was about righting the wrongs of the past and giving something back to the world he had once abandoned. Elsa had been right. There were people who cared about him, people who had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. When the news broke that Tom had been arrested, Jared felt an unexpected weight lift from his shoulders. The threat of Tom's cruelty was over, and for the first time in a long while, Jared felt the stirrings of peace. He knew the mountain would never be the same, but it was no longer a place of isolation and sorrow. It was a place of potential, of new beginnings. Elsa's encouragement didn't stop there. She kept telling Jared that the town needed him, that he didn't have to remain hidden away anymore. Slowly, with her support, Jared began to visit the town more regularly. He would stop by Elsa's inn, where she had set a place for him at the table, never asking too many questions, just letting him be. The conversation started slowly, small talk at first, then deeper talks about the past, the present, and what the future could look like. Jared began to reconnect with others in the community. Some were curious, some were cautious, but they all welcomed him back with open arms. It wasn't easy. Jared still struggled with the ghosts of his past, but he was determined to make a change. The isolation no longer felt like a shield, it felt like a prison. And so, Jared started to step out of the cage he had built for himself. He began to hunt again, but this time it was different. He hunted ethically, using the skills he had honed over the years to provide for the people in town. He didn't hunt for sport. He hunted to feed those who needed it, to give back to the community that had never truly abandoned him. Blaze, once a symbol of Jared's own desperation, had become his closest friend, his constant companion. Together, they had built something new, something that couldn't be broken by the storms of the past. With each step forward, Jared realized that he had been given a second chance, not just for himself, but for the world around him. Blaze had saved him from the abyss, and now Jared was going to do the same for others. The mountain, which once held only memories of pain and loss, now stood as a place of healing. The cold, snow-covered landscape had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Jared's transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it perfect, but it was real. With Blaze by his side and Elsa's quiet guidance, Jared had found his way back to the world, and he would never turn away again. Jared never imagined a day would come when the mountains, once a reminder of loss, would feel like home again. It wasn't a grand, dramatic change, but rather a subtle, quiet transformation that began with the soft patter of paws beside him on the snowy trails. Walking through the forest with Blaze by his side, Jared realized he was no longer just passing through life. He was living it. Every step, every breath, no longer carried the weight of loneliness. The wind through the trees, the crunch of snow underfoot, all became a soundtrack to the new life he had slowly started to embrace. Elsa's visits, once filled with concern, now held laughter and easy conversations. The walls Jared had built so meticulously over the years started to crack, and with each story shared, each moment of connection, he felt something new take root inside him, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Belonging. The simple act of being around people, talking, laughing, connecting. It no longer felt like a chore. It felt like a privilege. The mountains, once cold and barren, now seemed to cradle him in their embrace, the peaks and valleys no longer filled with haunting memories, but with the possibility of a future. Jared's days had transformed from a haze of survival into a journey of discovery. He didn't need to be alone anymore. With Blaze, with Elsa, and with the slowly rebuilding community, Jared found that he had more than just the mountains to call home. He had a life, one he was no longer afraid to live. And as the snow melted, so did the last remnants of his isolation,